Hello there ladies and gentlemen, I'm TX141, also known as Paul. Welcome you all to a brand new pair of Ace in a Day gameplays for the arcade mode of War Thunder. In today's episode we shall be reviewing the Supermarine Spitfire Mk.Vc, a British fighter aircraft coming at a tier 3 and a battle rating of 5.3. To provide you a brief historical overview of the Mark V in general and the iteration depicted here today, we must realise that the Mark V was designed as a stopgap fighter in late 1940 to counter the German threat of the Junkers Ju-86P high altitude bomber. The British RAF felt there was a need for a pressurised version of the Spitfire which would be able to intercept this new threat from the German Luftwaffe at altitudes in excess of 10,000 metres. The design concept was thus: take a Spitfire Mark I and install the Merlin 45 series inline engine. This engine provided 1,440 horsepower and incorporated a single-stage supercharger. The carburetors, i.e. the parts of the engine that blend the air and fuel mixture together, were also redesigned so that they would function during negative or zero-G manoeuvres. This was a fault with the earlier engines featured on the Spitfire Mark I and Mark II variants. By February-March 1941 then, numerous Mark Is and Mark IIs had already been converted into Mark Vs and the plane was now in full combat service. A total of 6,479 Mark Vs were to be produced over the course of the Second World War and be categorised by 3 sub-variants. The first was the A, with 94 of these being produced and continuing to feature the A-type wing as in the Mark I. There were then 3,911 Mark V-Bs, which initially featured the B-type wing. This wing was clipped post-August 1941 in reaction to the arrival of the technologically superior Focke-Wulf 90A in the European theatre of operations. The clipped wing was intended to increase the Mark V-B's roll rate and improve its top airspeed at lower altitudes to remain combat effective. The final subvariant, the one on your screen right now, is the Mark V-C. 2,467 of these were produced in total, and these planes saw the introduction of the Universal Type C wing, which was to mount 4 20mm Hispano Mk.2 cannons, 2 to each wing. The plane's fuselage was also strengthened, by comparison with that of the Mark V-B, so that the plane could act as a fighter bomber, carrying either a single 500-pound bomb under fuselage or 2 250-pound bombs, one under each wing. The plane was powered by a Merlin 50 inline engine, providing an output of 1,470 horsepower and giving it a top speed of 374 miles per hour or 602 kilometers an hour. The later Mark V-Cs were to receive the same treatment as the later Mark V-Bs, i.e. the clipped wings. Although primarily the Mark V-C was to see service overseas in the Mediterranean, North African, Burmese and Australian theatres of operations, so the clipped wing feature was less common at first. Very few Mark V-Cs were to see service in Europe against the Spear Focke-Wulf 90A, with the majority of the operational service being overseas. The Mark V-C therefore was to see service outside of Europe all the way up to the end of the Second World War, but it was to give birth in June 1942 to the Spitfire F Mark IX and help turn the tide back into British hands in the skies over Europe. And so our historical overview out of the way, let us see how the Spitfire Mark V-C handles in War Thunder. For our first game of today, we're on the ground strike map Crater, using the following setup. Air target belts are our 20mm cannons, as the mixture of high explosive fragmentation incendiary and high explosive fragmentation incendiary semi-armour piercing incendiary rounds is absolutely devastating when going up against fighters and bombers alike. On top of this, we also have to consider that the lack of tracers can work to our advantage when we get in behind someone who is oblivious to our presence. If we open fire and we miss, we do not have a tracer that whizzes by their cockpit to warn them of our presence, so unless they look behind or hear the rounds flashing past their cockpit, they will be none the wiser, allowing us to get in even closer and line up our second and more deadly shot on target. Of course, there is the disadvantage that at longer distances, if you open fire and miss, you do not have a tracer to correct your shots to, but we try to mitigate this by aiming in for closer distances, and that is why our gun convergence is set at 300 metres. We intend to use turn fights or tight stall fights where needed in order to bring our opponents down, and 300 metres gun convergence works very well when we want to try and keep our opponents at arm's length, i.e. 200 to 400 metres. On top of this, we also have to consider that a 300 metre gun convergence provides a huge amount of spray, or a shotgun effect if you will, at distances of 600 metres or more, which is brilliant for those long distance head-ons and indeed when going up against heavily armed and armoured bombers such as a B-17, but more on that later. We also have the standardised fuel load of 30 minutes to ensure that we can make it to the end of the game unscathed in terms of fuel capacity. And we kickstart by trying to pursue a Spitfire Mk.Vc who has just brought down one of our friendly I-185s. We charge in for the head-on using our war emergency power, and we cut them off as they break down into a high-speed dive. Here we see that we cannot pursue the Spitfire Mk.Vc as they are more manoeuvrable in a dive up to higher speeds, i.e. in excess of 650 km an hour, when the planes become a little bit more comparable. And this means that we have to abort, but fortunately for us a friendly Messerschmitt 109 is pursuing that Spitfire, and we can now turn our attentions to a Messerschmitt 109 G2 Trop who is trying to pursue us. We break into a 180 degree turn to bring our speed down below 450 km an hour, and we go for the head on. Snap rolling very well here in order to ensure that the G2 cannot get a shot onto us, and we brake underneath, with our nose coming down in the perfect position to allow us to initiate a rudder turn and then bring our roll rate in order to provide the full profile of our plane to initiate a tighter turn. We also activate our landing flaps as this plane does not have the combat flap setting to make an even tighter turn, bleed out our energy and then use the rudder once more to come around and bring ourselves onto target on the G2. And we finally bring them down for what is our first kill. At this point we put our nose back up and go into a sharp climb, because we want to catch the A6M3 in a head-on, as we know they are coming for us. It's at this point that we now turn to using the 20mm Hispano shotgun feature at longer distances thanks to our tight gun convergence. We open fire at 1,250 metres and catch their pilot at 800 metres, thanks to their lack of cockpit armour, probably a low pilot vitality, and also the sheer spray of these high explosive rounds, which when instant are absolutely devastating, as iterated earlier. It's at this point that we go for a reload, level out, and now begin to contemplate our next move. And in this game, this is going to be a slower game in general, despite the fact we've had quite a fast opening. Our role here is going to be Bomber Hunter, over Fighter Hunter, Boom and Zoom, or Turn Fighter. The reason being is thus. For a battle rating of 5.3 and Tier 3, the Spitfire Mk.Vc is not the ideal high altitude fighter. There are many that can technically outclass it, such as the Spitfire Mk.14E, the Focke-Wulf 190D9, the Messerschmitt 109 G6 and the Yakovlev Yak 9B. And these planes also all have the armament which is capable of bringing such bombers such as the Yer-2 and the B-17 down quite easily, just as much as the 420mm Hispanos can on the Mk.Vc here. But the difference is this. With increasing altitude it is harder to pick up speed usually, even if you are flying these high altitude planes. To give you an example, the Focke-Wulf 190D9 needs its speed at approximately 350 km an hour to be able to perform manoeuvres and to stay on target, and at the same time planes such as the Spitfire F-Mark14 also need higher speeds, i.e. 300 km an hour more, to do the same. With the Mk.Vc you do not have this issue as much. Instead you can be at 250 km an hour and this plane still handles rather well, and it echoes the manoeuvrability and handling characteristics of the Mk.5B at lower speeds. And this enables us to continue in the fight when high altitude fighters that rely on their speed may not be able to stay on the fight. We notice that the enemy B-17 below us is being pursued by a friendly Yak-7 and a number of other friendly fighters, so we try to put a little bit of pressure on the BTD. As we continue over we see that our acceleration, especially in excess of say 350 km an hour, is rather poor, and with increasing altitude our engine's performance is gradually waning. We have started to feel the effect at approximately 4,000 metres, but the effect really comes into force in excess of 5,000 metres, if not 6,000. The BTD goes for a dive and tries to cut underneath us, but we open fire once again and bring them down quite quickly. With 3 kills now in the bag, we push back up to higher altitudes, and we should really come into discussion of the climb rate of the Spitfire Mk.Vc. The climb rate is sufficient, and what is interesting is a lot of players, it would seem, when going up against this plane, underestimate the power of the climb rate of this aircraft. It will not outclimb everything it faces, indeed its climb rate is more average for its battle rating, but the difference is you can continue to apply this climb rate, whereas other planes cannot. Again, returning to the speed argument concerning say a Focke-Wulf 190D9, and I say this in particular because this is a plane which could technically do this bomber hunting role just as well. The Focke-Wulf 190D9 needs to be at a speed of approximately 350 km an hour, or even 400 km an hour ideally, in order to initiate a climb. A Spitfire Mk.5B does not. It can be at approximately 320 km an hour or even 300 to kick a climb off. And this means that this plane can continue to climb when the D9 might have to level out, build up its speed and then kick off the climbing stages again. And this means we can now pursue a B-17 who's approximately at 4,500 metres altitude as they go for a small dive. We're going to open fire and put a few rounds in. And we can see here how we're having to fight not only the change in lead conditions against the B-17, but also the recoil pattern of our 20mm cannons. We stay on the back of the B-17 and pick them off during our second burst, using our limited amount of armour, of which the Mk.V.C has more armour than the Mk.V.B historically, and I believe this is represented in game, to soak up some of the 12.7mm machine gun turret fire from the back of the B-17. We lever out once again and pursue another B-17 off on the horizon who is bombing our airfield. And let us come back to the consideration of taking down the bombers and the recoil effects. We saw with our initial burst how, despite the B-17 changing position and therefore requiring us to change our lead position, we also saw that our indicator, or our firing indicator, was shaking quite uncontrollably. The 420mm cannons, especially when fired at speeds below 300 km an hour, are a handful to manage on the recoil. You will feel this plane shake from side to side, and a number of times this can lead you to completely miss your target over a longer period burst, say 3 seconds or more in time duration. Here the enemy B-17 goes to the dive once again, and we are going to use the same tactic as with the other B-17, cutting across and then coming in behind, but at a slightly longer distance. We do not want to get within 300 metres of the target because we know we'll be dead. We ideally want to stay more than 600 metres behind the target. Here we open fire at long distance and try to get some glancing shots, but we can see the indicator is shaking a little bit to give you an idea of the recoil on the 20mm cannons, but also at the same time we are just too far away and we do not have a tracer to line up our shots on target. We instead go into a bit of a dive and then yo-yo back up. With our additional energy now, we open fire at long distance once more, but completely miss. With our speed being in excess of 450 km an hour for the most part, the recoil effects are being mitigated to some extent, which means as we get in close, we can bring the B-17 down with what is left of our ammunition, and soak up some more 12.7mm machine gun fire. We've also picked up our ace in the day now, and it seems as though we have dispatched the majority, if not all, of the high altitude bomber threat on the enemy team. And this is where we demonstrate the consistency of the Mk.V.C in being able to deal with the enemy heavy bombers or medium bombers that try to stay up high and drop the base gradually. Having completed our reload and we see that we're at an altitude of 5,000 metres, we come back to the discussion of where this plane continues to perform and where it drops out. And the overall performance of this plane does drop away at 5,000 metres or higher. It does not drop very rapidly by comparison with say a similar aircraft to this, the P-51 Cannon Mustang, which loses a very good portion of its performance above 4,000 metres altitude, but the performance drop off begins to gradually occur at 5,000 metres, and you will feel it most notably at 7,500 metres altitude when the acceleration in particular of this plane, even in a gentle climb, begins to slope off dramatically. What this means is technically this plane can compete all the way up to the altitudes that a lot of high altitude fighters may occupy, but at the same time you have to be aware of the limitations of your engine's performance, as whilst the Merlin 50 engine is quite good, it does lose out because of the single stage supercharger the higher and higher you go, especially a good portion of the enemy fighters you now face having 2-stage superchargers by comparison with your own. We also have to now consider what we can do in this altitude position. We are up incredibly high by comparison with everyone else on the battlefield, and this means that we should now lend ourselves towards boom and zoom tactics. But the problem is, and we come back to our point concerning the Spitfire F Mark 9 at the start of the game. The roll rate of this plane, as we see right now, locks up tremendously in excess of 440 km an hour in the midst of a dive, and this lockup is replicated in the level at approximately 500 km an hour, although you may even feel the effect at a speed of 400 km an hour if you look closely enough. Instead we have to try and go after targets who are flying dead level, and fortunately for us this P-51 Mustang is flying in a sharp turn, which means we can pick them off as they just hang in mid-air for us and pick up our 6th kill. This means that boom and zoom tactics are rather limited for the Mk.V.C. If your opponents are flying in straight lines or in very slow manoeuvres as we saw there, you'll be able to pick them off quite easily. If they start jerking from side to side or use a snap roll or indeed try to roll out underneath you, as a number of Focke-Wulf pilots will be able to, it'll be very difficult for you to follow them or even get a shot onto target, meaning that you will have to scrap that run and head back up to higher altitude or just fly off into the distance. We level out now at 3,000 metres approximately in terms of altitude, and we are trying to reduce our altitude cap and make sure that none of the enemy fighters can push upwards, and at the same time we do not proceed any further upwards into the altitude sphere. Reason being that if we do, we are going to once again suffer the boom and zoom issues we have already discussed. And really this echoes the performance that we saw at the Spitfire Mk.V.B, as you may see using the link in the top right corner of your screen, as displayed now. We saw in that review that the plane could use boom and zoom tactics quite well, but we had to go up against opponents who were either in quite low speed regions, performing exacerbated manoeuvres, or opponents who were quite close and our boom and zoom passes were quite short, which meant that our speed did not go in excess of say 700 km an hour or more. The higher the speed of this plane in a dive, the less controllable its ailerons will be. Its elevator remains strongly controllable, and so does the rudder, but it is the ailerons which really suffer, as we can see once again here as we push towards 700 km an hour. But our elevator and rudder are staying true, and it means we can try and drop a shot on this enemy Spitfire here, who again is flying dead level, and we pick off a Mk.Vc for what is kill number 7. Nothing spectacular about that, but this echoes the concept of if your opponent is flying in a straight line, this plane will be able to pick them off in a boom and zoom pass. And here we use the energy we have maintained to get away from an enemy Focke 190A who has just been shot down by a friendly I-185. At this point we begin to zoom climb once again, and we look towards a different horizon. So as we say, this echoes a good portion of the manoeuvrability case from the Mk.Vc, but there will be some differences as we try to latch onto a P-47 Thunderbolt, who is going to fly underneath us, perhaps through the fact they haven't spotted us or the fear of our 420mm cannons in the front. We open fire but miss and come around. Again realising if we try to split S, we'll probably go into the sea, or just not come around on target as quickly, and we can begin to open fire. The Thunderbolt pilot, to their credit, is braking left, right and centre, but we pick up a critical hit, which knocks out a good portion of their elevator control, and then we finish them off for what is our final kill of the game, kill number 8. At this point we reload once again, and we should really discuss the ammo capacity of this plane. 480 cannon rounds or 120 rounds per gun is quite a lot, but you will exhaust this quite quickly, as many of you will be aware from the Mk.Vc, the 120mm cannon round loadout was not ideal, and you could exhaust the rounds quite quickly thanks to the fact the 20mm Hispano Mk.2 cannons have a high rate of fire. You've technically doubled up the number of rounds that you have per cannon in this plane because it's 120 rounds per gun, but still be aware of the fact that a sustained burst on a B-17 can lead you to deplete over half of the rounds available before you realise it, and this means that if you go into an engagement with a number of targets, you may run out of ammunition before you get the final shot on the final target in the kill chain. We again pick up on a B-17 trying to attack our friendly ships towards the south of the map, and we proceed to intercept. But this is again going to be a more gradual interception, and we have to provide an ample amount of lead here in order to ensure that we can get the interception pass at the right time. In fact, it is going to turn out that the B-17, if allowed to continue, will reach our ships before we can reach them, and this highlights the rather poor top speed of the Mk.Vc by comparison with its fighter contemporaries at the battle rating. We are not getting anywhere as fast as the majority of our opponents or our contemporaries, but once we get there we can deliver the damage. Unfortunately today we will not get there, as the game has just ended and we now proceed towards the post-game stats. We see that our 8 kills allowed us to obtain 43,390 silver lions and 1,445 research points, all going towards our work on the Meteor F Mark III. This first game then has been a demonstration of the Mk.Vc in a more typical role of bomber hunter. Although to get into this role we did have to intercept some of the enemy fighters, including the Messerschmitt 19G2 who tried to turn fight with us, and eventually we gained the upper hand as the turn fight went into the vertical rather than the horizontal. And we also brought down the A6M3 in a long distance head-on, as they are the more manoeuvrable fighter in terms of turn fighting, and they do have the lower stall speed by comparison with our own fighter. Once these higher altitude threats were dispatched, we could then pursue the enemy bombers, but we had to take a gradual approach because of our average climb rate and our rather poor acceleration on the level by comparison with a good number of our battle rating contemporaries. And when we say contemporaries, we mean planes such as the Spitfire LF Mark 9, the Spitfire F Mark 14E, the Focke 190 D9 and the Yakovlev Yak 9P. But once we got into a close enough distance to the enemy bombers, i.e. approximately 600 metres distance, if not a little bit further away, we were able to bring them down quite quickly and use our armour to keep us alive. And then we could convert ourselves into a more linear boom and zoom fighter to pick up the rest of our 8 kills and come first by comparison to the rest of our team. We have therefore shown that the Spitfire Mk.Vc can do its job if given the time and space to do so, but the gradual approach can be a little bit frustrating and a bit tedious. So now we're going to move into a more aggressive game and show where the Spitfire Mk.Vc excels when it is not limited to just hunting bombers for a good portion of the match, as this is a time consuming role and we may not always have the time available to us. For our concluding game of today, we're on the ground strike map Merchant Fleet using the same setup as before. But the differences this time are firstly that we're in a battle rating 6.0 game and we are going up against the likes of the high altitude fighters including the Messerschmitt 19K4. these planes will be able to clearly outclimb us and have the engine power on us. The second difference is that we're on a map which is significantly smaller than Crater, meaning that in the initial head-on climbs the two teams will interdict one another much earlier on. But we have one key item in our favour which allows us to mitigate this, and that is our overall performance nature in terms of the speed range in which we are combat effective. In my opinion, the Spitfire Mk.Vc is very strong in a speed range of 275 to 375 km an hour. At this point, all three control surfaces, i.e. the ailerons, the elevators and the rudder, will work very well, and at the same time this plane is able to continue to perform quite nicely all the way up to approximately 400 km an hour, although do remember in a dive that the roll rate begins to lock up at 440 km an hour or in the level at 500, and the stall speed of this plane lies at approximately 155 km an hour, which is quite low, and the overall handling characteristics begin to drop off at 220 km an hour, which you need to be wary of. Especially if you start to open fire, you will bleed your speed even faster and cause the plane to shake quite uncontrollably. As we level out then, we look around and see that none of the enemy fighters have pushed for higher altitude, bar say a Focke-Wulf 190A4 directly in front of us at long distance, and we note that there is a Messerschmitt 19K4 who has dived down to knock out our friendly Dornier 217M, and we will need to keep an eye on them very shortly. In the meantime then, we will push for the head-on with the A4 and try to force them into a turn fight. We can see that the K4 is already pushing up towards the back of the map, and we are keeping our eyes on them and the LA7 just off to our right, who seems to be damaged. We snap row out of the way of the A4 cutting across their line of fire, and as we come around we notice that the A4 will not be pursuing us but instead going after two of our friendly Focke-Wulf 190s. And we can see here how the poor top speed, by comparison to our battle rating contemporaries or even some of those below us, and our poor dive speed, or our ability to pick up speed in the dive I should say, means that we will not be able to catch up with the A4, as even our straight line acceleration, especially above 300 km an hour, is rather poor. At the same time then, we proceed to take on the K4 as we need to dispatch them to gain superiority in altitude for the rest of this game. We take a snapshot at a head-on, we miss and snap right out of the way. Before coming around once again, the K4 turns off to the right and then performs a split S to try and get the advantage on us by using their superior engine power to then loop over the top of us. We have not used our landing flaps here to make sure we do not stall out early, and this means we can cut underneath the K4, but due to the recoil effects we happen to miss. But as the K4 tries to break away now, as they are out of options, we cut them apart for our first kill, and we have now gained the altitude advantage for the rest of this match, so long as we are not lured off by the concept of that Year 2 just off to our left. Whilst they are enticing, we have to remember we are not fast and we do not have the acceleration to catch up to them, or at least not in a quick space of time. And now that we are positioned at approximately 4,000 metres altitude above the enemy spawn, this means that we can suppress anything that tries to climb up to higher altitudes, and we can put a lot of pressure and make our opponents play the game we want to play rather than the game that they want to play. We reload here, and at 4,100 metres altitude our friendly bombers are able to fly unscathed for the rest of the match, and we begin to come down on the I-185. Although we notice as they started to climb they've picked up on our presence and have now started to dive instead, and straight away we are performing an intimidation factor on the enemy team, as 420mm cannons is quite nasty even at a battle rating 6.0 match, as this is an armament borne by a number of planes such as the Ki-84 Otsu and the Tempest Mark V, so you are comparable in that regard. In the meantime then, we're going to stay above the enemy spawn, and although I did say that this game is going to have a lot less time on it when I finished off talking about the first game, this is actually resonating to some extent. We've been incredibly aggressive and we've actually managed to gain the altitude advantage against opponents who could technically have competed for it later on in the game, because we have not been lured off by the treasures that could have headed back to our overall airfield position, such as that Year 2. In the meantime then, we go for a boom and zoom, once again highlighting the poor high speed dive characteristics in terms of the aileron control of the Spitfire Mk.Vc, but how we can actually mitigate this if we go for targets that are flying straight, such as this LA7B20. We get in a little bit closer and then use the shotgun effect of our ammunition at a distance of 500 to 400 metres to cut them apart. We then begin to break up with a shot in the Messerschmitt 19G here, and we pick apart the G6 for another kill, seeing that once again the G6 were flying on a relatively gentle turn, and this means that we did not have any trouble latching onto them. Although at this point we must make sure not to overextend this boom and zoom pass, but actually build up our altitude, because we do not have the ability to pick up such a high speed in a dive. Meanwhile our opponents may be able to pick up the speed as they go into a climb. Planes such as the P-51D here will be able to catch this plane off guard if we do not continue to look behind and make sure that we return to higher altitude in the right time. and this means the P-51D-30 overshoots and now cuts underneath us, and we have a Focke-Wulf 90 A5 who has also tried to come around in the midst of what looks as though a stall turn. Although fortunately for us, the A5 has dived down towards lower altitudes and we can pick up our 4th kill on the P-51D. At this point we keep an eye on the Focke-Wulf 90 who is coming up underneath us and we need to react fast. We cut over the top and then break out to the side. As the A5 opens fire, the rounds go behind us as we snap over the top of them, and this means now the A5 is in a weaker position in terms of energy, and as they try to break down towards lower altitudes once again, we can come around to get a shot on target. We can bring ourselves around quite quickly onto target and we achieve a critical hit on their rudder. We were in the midst of a reload and that was a mistake on my part. I should not have reloaded there, as I did have a couple of rounds left if I remember correctly. As we level out then, we see that the A5 is going into the water for kill number 5, and that is our ace in the day. A little bit of a pressure situation, but nothing we couldn't handle in this plane, which handles very well at lower speeds as we have just seen, with the P-51D practically struggling to pick up their manoeuvrability as they drop their speed, and the A5 following suit as they had to dive away. We now continue to snap over the enemy flak because of the ships, which is always an ever-present threat in any given game with any given plane, as another AA round comes quite close to our right wing. We go for the climb once again and note an LA-7 that has managed to go after our friendly Year 2 up at higher altitudes. Straight away, as soon as we get pushed away from the enemy spawn, we lose the position that we crave and we allow the enemy high altitude fighters the positions that they want. And now this is going to be more of a problem if the LA-7 comes over towards us, as they will have the ability to have the speed, the energy advantage and the overall positional advantage on us, and this means that we have to play their game and not the other way around. We're tempted to type something to the Year 2, but at a distance of 10 kilometers away, our efforts will be fruitless if they try to turn towards us, so we're just going to have to continue to climb for the time being, build up some altitude using our average climb rate, and then come around and try to reassess the situation. And this is the importance of being aggressive forthwith. If you're aggressive in the Spitfire Mk.Vc, you'll be able to make your opponents fight your game, not the other way around, as we are now having to judge the game of the enemy team. We can see a number of black dots coming up above the cloud layer, and these are probably enemy fighters, ones that would prefer higher altitudes, and now we're going to have to contend with their game plan, not our game plan. We see that the Year 2 is being successful in diving down towards the enemy bases and at the same time luring down that LA-7, so they have actually succeeded in helping us out here. As we look along and we can see our acceleration means that we very gradually head towards 400 km an hour, having started off at approximately 340 if I remember correctly as we came out of that Immelman. And this is one of the more painful sides of the Spitfire Mk.Vc, especially with increasing altitude, is that your acceleration is perhaps dire to some extent. In terms of altitude performance ranges then, where does this plane perform best? Well, if you situate this plane somewhere between 2,000 to 4,500 metres altitude, you'll find that the overall engine performance and the plane's handling is probably at its maximum, with a preference towards 3,500 metres altitude. You can press towards 5,000 metres altitude, but be aware of the limitations, as our Year 2 manages to knock out the enemy airfield in their dying pass, and now we see an enemy Wellington being pursued by a friendly Spitfire, and we go for one final boom and zoom pass here. And we're going to see how once again, if your opponents are oblivious to you and fly in straight lines, you can shred them to pieces with your 20mm Hispano Cannons. We notice the LA-7B here, who is flying levels to some extent, and we try and open fire. We get a glancing hit, but nothing major, and then we pick up a glancing hit again and rip off their right wing, using the shotgun spray effects of our 20mm cannons, and now we notice a Heinkel 111 on our team being pursued by both an LA-9 and a Focke-Wulf 190A. Two planes which would love a little bit of altitude or extra speed, and we can shred them to pieces. One, and then we go for the LA-9, making up a double kill, and that's our 8th and final kill for the game, and one Heinkel 111H, safe and sound, as we fly off into the distance and pretty much tease the enemy fighters who have just spawned into the fact that they couldn't take down the Mk.Vc, the plane which technically is not as strong as them within the higher altitude battle ratings. And now we should push on towards the post-game stats. Again, we can see that our 8 kills allowed us to obtain 49,190 silver lions, and on top of this we accreted 1,541 research points towards our work on the Meteor F Mark III. We come on to the final question of how one can defeat the Mk.Vc then, and to do so in the majority of cases you will not be flying a more manoeuvrable aircraft. Although the more manoeuvrable types include the Spitfire Mk.2B, the A6M5 and the Ki-43-3. The alternative is where you are flying a plane with superior engine power and, as a result, a higher climb rate, were a number of examples including but not limited to the P-51D Mustang, the Spitfire F Mark 14E, the Focke 490D series aircraft, the Messerschmitt 109Gs and Ks, the Tempest Mark V, or the LA-7 or LA-9. In all of these instances you will be able to outclimb the Mark 5C from the outset, and you can gain the initial altitude position to perform boom and zoom runs on the plane. In doing so you can then goad the Mark 5C up to chase you into the zoom climb, at which point despite its low stall speed of 155 km an hour it will stall out eventually behind you, at which point you can use a hammerhead or a split S to come around for a secondary pass. And you can rinse and repeat this until the Mark 5C is burning in front of you, or the pilot becomes frustrated and pushes down towards lower altitudes. Indeed, in the second game, if the Messerschmitt 19K4 pilot had simply gone up into a loop and used their superior engine power to force us to stall out behind them, it could have been a completely different story than the third place we managed to obtain in this game. We were able to force the enemy team to play our game, and that is exactly how the Spitfire Mark 5C can be used successfully. By suppressing the enemy team and forcing them under a lot of pressure, especially when they cannot use the higher altitude positions they crave, you will find that despite your technical inferiority by comparison to your battle rating contemporaries, you will be the one to watch, and you will be the fighter that reigns supreme. And so I've been TX141, and if you've enjoyed this video, why not leave a like, comment or subscribe for future War Thunder videos on my channel. Yet until next time, ladies and gentlemen, take care and good luck in the skies.